Look closely at this handwriting found in the wreckage. It is an exact match to my own, but I didn't write this, at least not yet. This fragmented note claims February 28, 2026 is the day I die. We're piecing together a future self's warning before the static takes over completely. 3 days ago, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the old Harrow Canal site. Nobody goes there anymore, not since the 2019 structural collapse swallowed the lower maintenance corridor and flooded everything beneath the eastern embankment. The city fenced it off, slapped a condemned notice on the gate, and let the water and the rot do the rest. I went because my editor wanted atmospheric B-roll for a completely unrelated piece, something about urban decay, forgotten infrastructure, the kind of footage that fills 30 seconds between commercial breaks and gets forgotten by morning. I almost said no. I've been thinking about that almost ever since. The fence had already been pulled back at the corner, bent inward like something had pushed through from the inside rather than the outside. That detail bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately name. I told myself it was scavengers, or kids, or the kind of person who doesn't read condemnation notices as warnings. I slipped through anyway, because the light was right and the deadline wasn't, and I had 40 minutes before I needed to be back at the car. The interior of the collapsed section is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't stood inside a space that was never meant to be open to the sky. The walls lean at angles that feel structurally offensive. Water has stained everything below knee height in bands of rust and black, and the smell is a particular combination of standing water and oxidized metal that settles at the back of your throat and stays there. I moved carefully, filming the textures of the decay, watching where I stepped, and that is the only reason I saw it at all, because I was looking down. It was wedged between a collapsed support beam and a section of concrete that had sheared away from the wall and settled at an angle, creating a shallow pocket approximately 6 inches deep. The water damage was extensive. Whatever binding had originally held it together had dissolved into a kind of fibrous crust, and the cover, if there had ever been a proper cover, was gone entirely. What remained were pages, roughly 40 of them, fused in sections, separating in others, the ink bleeding sideways through the grain of the paper in the way that ink does when it has been wet and dried and wet again so many times that it has become part of the material rather than a mark on its surface. I almost left it. I want to be precise about that, because in the days since, I have returned to that moment more times than I can count, examining it from every angle, looking for the version of events where I leave it in the mud and walk back to my car, and none of this becomes what it is becoming. But I didn't leave it. I picked it up because the handwriting on the uppermost visible page stopped me so completely that I forgot for a full 3 or 4 seconds to breathe. I need you to understand what I mean when I say the handwriting is mine. I don't mean it resembles mine, or shares certain characteristics, or could be mistaken for mine by someone who wasn't paying close attention. I mean that looking at it produces the same cognitive dissonance as looking at your own reflection doing something you are not doing. The particular way the letter A closes slightly too tight at the top, the habit of applying more pressure on downstrokes that makes every line of text look faintly embossed, the slight leftward drift that begins around the middle of any given line and has to be corrected, which creates this rhythmic wavering that my third-grade teacher flagged as a problem and that I have never fully resolved in the 30 years since. It was all there. Every idiosyncratic, unreplicable marker of my handwriting was present on pages that had been sitting in floodwater under a condemned building for a period of time I have not yet been able to determine. I brought it back to my apartment. I laid it on the kitchen table on top of a layer of newspaper and I stood over it for a long time with my coat still on, not touching it, just looking at the portions of text that were legible through the water damage. Most of it was fragmentary, partial sentences, single words, strings of numbers. But the final page, which had been somewhat protected by the compression of the pages above it, was different. The final page was almost entirely readable. And what it said on the final page is why I'm recording this right now, 7 days before the date written there, because I need someone outside of my own head to know what I know. The date at the bottom of the final page, written in my handwriting, underlined twice, is February 28, 2026. Below the date, in letters slightly larger than the surrounding text, are 5 words. This is where it ends. I photographed everything before I touched it further. I have the photographs. I have the logbook itself, currently sealed in a Ziploc bag on my desk, because I became frightened of leaving it in the open, which is an instinct I don't fully understand but have stopped questioning. I have begun the process of cross-referencing the legible portions of the earlier pages with a calendar, and what I have found in even this preliminary examination has made it very difficult to sleep. Here is the first thing I found that I cannot explain away. On page 7, partially obscured by water damage but reconstructible, there is a reference to a broken heating element in apartment 4C. My apartment is 4C. My heating element broke on the 14th of this month. I only noticed it was broken because the temperature dropped 11 degrees overnight, and I woke up with my breath fogging above my face. It is a small thing. It is the kind of small thing that gets dismissed immediately when you are trying to be rational, when you are trying to be the kind of person who does not spiral, who does not connect dots that might just be proximity and coincidence and the human brain's relentless appetite for pattern. But here is the thing about the heating element. The logbook doesn't just mention that it broke, it mentions the sound it made when it failed. A specific rhythmic clicking, 3 beats and then silence, 3 beats and then silence, like a signal. I described that sound to no one. I barely registered it consciously myself until I read it written down in my own handwriting in a book that has been underwater since before the element broke. That is when I stopped trying to be rational. That is when I started recording. There are 40 pages in this logbook. I have so far been able to reconstruct approximately half of them to a readable state. What I have read accounts for events spanning a 7-day period, the 7 days, I believe, that I am currently living through. The entries describe where I was, what I saw, what I thought. They describe conversations I have had this week with accuracy that should be impossible. And they are moving toward February 28th with the steady, indifferent momentum of something that was written before it happened and will happen because it was written. I don't know yet whether this logbook is a warning or a record. I don't know whether the distinction matters. What I know is that somewhere in the remaining pages, the ones still fused together, the ones I haven't yet managed to separate without destroying, there is information about what happens on February 28th. There is information about the exact circumstances. There is a description of an encounter that the legible fragments refer to obliquely in a way that makes my hands shake when I try to read it directly, that I have been circling around for 3 days without being able to look at straight. I am going to look at it straight. I am going to document everything, every entry, every correlation, every piece of audio evidence, every marker on my body that shouldn't be there but is. I am going to do this because whoever wrote this, whatever version of me sat down and put these words on these pages, went to considerable effort to leave them somewhere they could be found. The wreckage wasn't random. The location wasn't arbitrary. The logbook was placed there for me to find, and I think if you stay with me through what comes next, you will understand why that might be the most terrifying sentence I have ever written. 7 days. We start counting now. I didn't sleep last night. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because every time I closed my eyes, I found myself doing the math again. 7 days, 168 hours. The number kept reassembling itself in the dark behind my eyelids, precise and patient, and utterly indifferent to whether I was ready for it. By 4 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and went back to the logbook. I have developed a method for separating the fused pages without destroying them. The process involves a shallow tray of distilled water, a temperature I maintain at exactly 32 degrees Celsius, and a set of dental tools I ordered online 2 years ago for a model building hobby I abandoned within a month. You introduce moisture gradually at the edges, allow the adhesion to relax, and then work with lateral pressure rather than vertical force. It takes approximately 40 minutes per page. It requires a level of sustained concentration that leaves me feeling hollowed out afterward, the way you feel after an exam or a difficult conversation. Not tired exactly, but emptied. Last night I separated 3 more pages. What I found on them has changed the nature of what I thought I was dealing with. I had been operating until last night under a framework that I can only describe as reluctant coincidence. The heating element, the specific vocabulary of certain entries that matched conversations I'd had this week almost verbatim. These were unsettling, but they existed within a range of possibility that my rational mind could, with sufficient effort, still reach across and touch. Coincidence is not impossible. Pattern recognition is a known cognitive vulnerability. People find faces in clouds. People find meaning in static. I know this. I have always known this. But let me tell you about Wednesday. Wednesday's entry, which I separated and reconstructed on Tuesday night without knowing what day it would describe, details a phone call. The call is from a number with a +44 country code, a United Kingdom number. From a contact the entry refers to only as the archivist. The entry describes the archivist as speaking in a voice that is measured in the way that someone is measured when they are controlling something, and records several fragments of what was said. The fragments include a reference to the Harrow Canal site, a reference to the specific structural collapse of 2019, and a question, recorded in quotation marks, attributed directly to the archivist, that reads, "Did you bring the whole thing out, or did you leave pieces behind?" On Wednesday afternoon at 2:17 p.m., I received a phone call from a UK number. I don't know anyone in the United Kingdom. The voice on the other end was calm and careful, and asked me, after a brief introduction I was too stunned to fully process, whether I had retrieved the complete logbook from the canal site or whether any portion of it remained at the location. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for approximately 6 minutes without moving. Then I went to the logbook entry and read the fragment again and understood with a completeness that left no room for the comfortable ambiguity I had been maintaining that the logbook was not describing possibilities, it was describing certainties. The archivist called back 4 hours later. I let it go to voicemail. The message is 43 seconds long, and I have listened to it 11 times now, and each time I hear something slightly different in the texture of the silence before the voice begins, a sound that I will get to shortly because it connects to something else, something in the audio recordings I have been making, something that took me 2 days to identify, and that once identified made the scope of this thing expand in a direction I was not prepared for. But first, the correlations, because I want to be rigorous about this. I want to document every point of contact between the logbook's timeline and the week I have actually lived, because the accumulation matters. The pattern is not in any single entry. The pattern is in what it means that all of them are accurate. Day 1 of the countdown. The logbook describes waking to find condensation on the inside of the bedroom window, forming a pattern, not random moisture, but a shape, a rough elongated oval with a smaller shape adjacent to it, resembling to my eyes, and recorded in the entry with faint evident unease, a human figure viewed from above. I woke on day 1 of the countdown to find condensation on my bedroom window. I photographed it before I touched it. The shape is there. You can see it in the image on screen right now. Whether you interpret it as I do is, I acknowledge, subjective, but the entry describes it, and the photograph confirms it, and both exist independent of each other. Day 2. The logbook entry for this day is one of the more complete sections, and it describes a sound that begins in the late afternoon and continues intermittently through the night. The entry calls it rhythmic interference, and notes that it seems to emanate from the walls of the apartment rather than from any identifiable external source, as though the building itself is producing it. On day 2 of the countdown, at approximately 4:45 p.m., I began to hear it. I have been recording it. The recordings are now 11 hours of audio material, and within that material there is something I need you to understand before I can explain what it means. The rhythm is not random. It is not the irregular percussion of pipes or the settling of old wood. It is structured. It repeats in a specific sequence: 4 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, 7 beats, longer pause, then the whole sequence again, with a consistency that I have now clocked at a deviation of less than 0.3 seconds across hundreds of repetitions. 4, 3, 7. I wrote those numbers down and stared at them for a long time before it occurred to me to format them differently. 4 degrees, 37 minutes north. A latitude, the beginning of a coordinate. I went back through the logbook's numerical sequences, the strings of digits I had initially cataloged without context, and I found the corresponding longitude embedded in an entry from day 3, formatted identically, disguised within what appeared to be a fragment of disconnected thought. I have not yet looked up where those coordinates point. I am recording this first because I want you to have this information before I know what it means, because I think there is a version of events where knowing what it means changes how I behave, and I am no longer certain that changing how I behave is safe. That thought, the thought that my behavior might be constrained, that the logbook might not just be predicting what happens, but actively requiring it to happen in order to remain accurate, arrived on day 3 and has not left. It sits at the center of everything now, this terrible question: if the logbook is right about everything else, and I do something the logbook doesn't describe, does the logbook become wrong? Or does the universe, and I use that word knowing how it sounds, knowing exactly how I would have responded to someone saying that 6 days ago, does the universe correct for my deviation? Day 3 also brought the scars. I need to take a moment here because this is the part that is hardest to talk about with the kind of detachment that responsible documentation requires. I have 2 marks on my left forearm that were not there on the morning of day 1. I noticed the first on day 2, a faint line, approximately 4 centimeters long, slightly raised, already in a state of healing that suggested it had been present for days, despite my certainty that it had not. I assumed I had cut myself without noticing, the way you sometimes do. I did not yet know to look for it in the logbook. On day 3, I found the entry. The logbook describes these marks. It describes their location with precision. Left forearm interior surface, the first approximately 4 centimeters below the crook of the elbow, the second parallel and approximately 1 centimeter lateral. It describes them as appearing between days 1 and 3, and it includes a detail that made me sit down on the kitchen floor and stay there for a while. It describes them not as wounds or injuries, but as markers, and it uses a specific phrase, so you know the transfer is complete, without explaining what transfer refers to, or who placed them there, or whether the placement was something that happened to me or something that I did. As of this morning, both marks are present. They are exactly where the logbook said they would be. The boundary between the written future and my living present is narrowing with every hour. The logbook is not a curiosity anymore. It is not a mystery to be solved from a safe intellectual distance. It is a document authored by someone who has already lived through what I am about to live through, and that person, that version of me, that future self navigating whatever comes after February 28th, or whatever went so catastrophically wrong on February 28th that they needed to leave a warning in the wreckage of a collapsed canal site. That person is trying to tell me something I have not yet been able to fully read. But I am getting closer. The fused pages are yielding. The static has a pattern, and the pattern has coordinates, and the coordinates point somewhere I will tell you about in detail once I have confirmed them, once I understand what they mean within the larger geography of this thing. There are 4 days left. I want to be very clear with you about something before I close this entry. I am not at peace with what I know. I am not approaching this with the steady pragmatism of someone who has accepted an outcome. I am frightened, and I am telling you that plainly because I think the frightened version of this account is the honest one, and honesty is the only thing I have left to offer a future that seems to have already decided what it wants from me. Stay with this. There is more to show you, and some of it, I promise you, you are not ready for. The coordinates point to a place called Veldmoor. I'll tell you what Veldmoor is in a moment. I'll tell you what I found when I looked it up, and what I found when I looked deeper, and what was already in the logbook waiting for me when I finally separated the day 4 and day 5 entries late last night. But I want to start with the audio, because the audio is where the architecture of this thing became visible to me, where I stopped seeing isolated events and started seeing a structure, a deliberate framework, something built rather than something that merely happened. I have been recording the rhythmic interference since it began on day 2. 11 hours became 17, became 31, became the 44 hours of continuous audio that now sits on my hard drive in a folder I have labeled somewhat grimly, Evidence. I have listened to all of it, not casually, analytically, with audio software that allows me to visualize the waveform, to isolate frequency bands, to strip out the ambient noise of the apartment and examine what remains. What remains is consistent in a way that should not be physically possible for a sound produced by a building. The sequence, 4 beats, 3 beats, 7 beats, does not vary. In 44 hours of recording, The sequence is repeated 1,847 times. Each repetition is metronomically identical. There is no drift, no fatigue, no environmental distortion. If I were producing that sound deliberately with a machine, I would need a machine of considerable precision. The walls of my apartment building were constructed in 1987 and are, to the best of my knowledge, ordinary concrete and insulation with no embedded mechanisms of any kind. But the sequence itself is only part of what the audio contains, because when I applied a high-pass filter to isolate frequencies above the range of normal hearing, a routine step in audio forensic analysis, something I learned years ago for a documentary project involving recorded anomalies, I found a second layer. Beneath the audible rhythm, present in the recording from the very first moment, but invisible to the unprocessed ear, there is a voice. I need you to understand what I mean by that carefully, because I am not speaking metaphorically, and I am not describing the phenomenon where human brains impose language onto white noise, because they are pattern-seeking machines, built to extract meaning from ambiguity. I am describing a voice, a human voice, speaking in a register just above the threshold of standard audio capture, compressed into the upper frequencies with a consistency that rules out artifact or equipment failure. I have isolated it. I have slowed it down by a factor of 4 and shifted it down 3 octaves, and what you are hearing, if you are watching this with sufficient audio quality, is the playback of that processed recording. I will tell you what it says because I know some of you will not be able to make it out through your speakers or headphones, and because I have listened to it enough times now that I can transcribe it without consulting the recording. The coordinates are the door. You already know what's on the other side. Don't let them tell you the book is the only copy. The voice is mine. I have run a spectral comparison between the isolated audio and a clean recording of my own voice that I made immediately upon identifying the anomaly. The match is not approximate. The match is near total, within the margins that audio forensic software uses to confirm identity. The voice in the walls of my apartment, speaking in frequencies I cannot naturally hear, is my voice. I have been sitting with that fact for approximately 18 hours. I do not have a framework that accommodates it comfortably. What I have instead is the logbook, and the logbook's Day 4 entry, which I separated and reconstructed this morning, and which contains a passage I want to read to you directly because I think my paraphrase would fail it. The entry reads, "The voice will be the hardest part, not because of what it says, but because of what it proves. Once you've heard yourself in the walls, you know the timeline isn't linear anymore. You're not being warned by a future self. The future self and the present self are running parallel. The book is the intersection point. The book is where both versions of you touch." Veldmore. In 1987, the same year my apartment building was constructed, which I notice now and do not know what to do with, a research installation was established at a site approximately 340 kilometers northeast of where I am currently sitting. The installation was part of a signals research program operated under a civilian academic framework, though the funding and the oversight, as I have found in archived documents that required several hours of searching to locate, traced back to sources that are difficult to categorize cleanly as either governmental or private. The program was called the Veldmore Temporal Correspondence Project. It ran for 11 years before being quietly decommissioned in 1998. I found 2 academic papers referencing the project by name. Both are from researchers I cannot locate in any current institutional context. The first describes the theoretical basis for what the paper calls temporal inscription, the idea that information can be physically encoded in material objects in such a way that the encoding bypasses the normal directionality of time. The mechanism is described at a level of abstraction that I cannot fully evaluate, involving resonant frequency states and what the paper terms causal anchoring. The second paper, written 3 years later by one of the same researchers, begins with a retraction of the first paper's conclusions and ends with a single sentence that has nothing to do with the preceding retraction. The subject will find the book when the subject is ready to find the book. The coordinates that the static gave me, 4 degrees 37 minutes north, and the longitudinal complement I extracted from the Logbook's Day 3 entry, point to a location approximately 2.3 kilometers from the former Veldmore installation site. I have not yet determined what is physically located at those coordinates. I have satellite imagery showing a landscape that is primarily marshland, with a single structure visible at the edge of the image's resolution. Rectangular, low profile, apparently abandoned. I have a road map overlay that shows no named road within 4 kilometers of the location. And I have a notation in the Logbook's Day 5 entry, which I am still partially reconstructing as I record this, that refers to the coordinates with a phrase I want to be very careful about how I present to you. The phrase is, "This is where you went the first time." Not where I will go, where I went, past tense, a thing already done in the book's grammar, though I have no memory of going anywhere near a marshland in the northeast, no memory of a low-profile building at the edge of satellite resolution, no memory of Veldmore or the Temporal Correspondence Project, or any of the infrastructure of this nightmare before I found the Logbook 3 days ago. Unless the memory is the thing that hasn't transferred yet. The marks on my arm, the ones the Logbook called markers, the ones it said would confirm the transfer was complete, I have been measuring them each morning. They are changing, not healing in the conventional sense. The tissue is doing something I do not have accurate medical language to describe. The margins of each mark are becoming more defined, as though the marks are being clarified rather than resolved, sharpened into precision rather than fading into skin. They look less like wounds each morning. They look more like they were put there on purpose. Someone in the audience right now is asking the question I have been asking for 3 days. What is the transfer? What moved from where to where? What was inscribed on my body and in a waterlogged logbook in a collapsed canal site? And what is the relationship between the frequency in my walls and the voice I've never heard myself use in that register? Lower, older somehow, carrying a weight that my current voice doesn't have. I don't have the complete answer yet, but I have a partial one. And the partial one comes from the most intact section of the logbook, a passage I found not on one of the fused interior pages, but on a fragment that had separated from the main body and was folded, deliberately it seems, into a kind of packet, tucked between 2 of the middle pages as though placed there specifically to be found before the surrounding entries. The fragment says, "The project didn't end in 1998. It moved. You moved it. You won't remember moving it because the version of you reading this is the one that exists before the move. But the move is the reason you found the book, and the book is the move. This is the only way the information could reach you. This is the only door that opens from the inside. There are 3 days left. The static continues. The marks continue their strange clarification. The archivist has not called again, but there is an email in my inbox from an address consisting of random characters and a domain I cannot trace, containing a single line: "Don't go to Veldmore before you finish the book." I am finishing the book as fast as the pages allow, and tomorrow I am going to tell you about the entry I have been avoiding, the one that describes the encounter, the meeting, the version of myself that the logbook says I will come face to face with in the hours before February 28th arrives. I have been avoiding it because some part of me believed that if I didn't read it, it couldn't happen. I understand now that the logic doesn't hold. The book has been right about everything. The book will be right about this. 2 more pages to separate. 12 hours of careful work. And then I'll know. The entry was dated within the logbook's internal chronology to day 6, which is today. I want to be precise about that. Not tomorrow, not yesterday, today. I separated the final relevant pages at 6 a.m. and read the day 6 entry in the gray early light of my kitchen while the static moved through the walls in its patient 4/3/7 rhythm. And when I finished reading, I sat with my hands flat on the table for a long time, because the entry describes exactly the morning I was having: the cold in the apartment, the quality of the light, the specific fatigue behind my eyes that comes from too many consecutive nights of inadequate sleep. It describes all of it, and then it describes what happens next. Let me tell you about the encounter first, and then I'll tell you what happened when the encounter actually occurred, because by the time I am recording this segment, it has already happened. The impossible thing has already taken place. I am on the other side of it now, and the other side is not what I expected. Not because it was better, but because it was so much more ordinary in its delivery than the scale of what it meant should have allowed. The logbook entry for day 6 reads as follows, and I want to be careful here. I want to read this as accurately as I can because the language is specific and the specificity matters. You will see yourself at 11 a.m. Not a reflection, not a hallucination. The other version will be standing near the window in your apartment, looking out at the street, wearing the gray jacket with the broken left cuff button you've been meaning to replace for 8 months. The other version will turn when you enter the room. The face will be yours, approximately 2 to 3 years older by surface evidence, gray at the temples, deeper lines at the corners of the eyes. The marks on the left arm will be visible and fully resolved, which is how you will know this version is past the transfer. The other version will speak first. It will say, "I'm sorry I couldn't make this easier. There wasn't a gentler door." At 10:58 a.m., I walked into my living room. I want to tell you that I was prepared. I had read the entry 4 times. I knew the time, the location, the words. I had constructed a mental architecture to receive this event and stay functional within it. I want to tell you all of that, and then I want to tell you that it made no difference at all. The figure near the window was me, not resembling me, not sharing my general physical profile, me. My face arranged into an expression of such precise and exhausted apology that I recognized it as the face I make when I have failed at something I cared about deeply and am about to have to explain why. The gray jacket with the broken left cuff button, the gray at the temples, the deeper lines, and the left arm, no jacket sleeve, the forearm visible, showing 2 marks that were not half-healed and clarifying, but complete, clean-edged, permanent-looking, like something that had always been there. He said, "I'm sorry I couldn't make this easier. There wasn't a gentler door. And I said nothing for a long time. The static in the walls seemed louder, though I cannot be certain whether it actually was, or whether the silence I was not filling made me more aware of it. Eventually, I said, "Are you dead on February 28th?" He looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, not quite relief, not quite sorrow, something in between that had the texture of a very old answer to a very new question. He said, "That's the wrong frame. February 28th isn't the end. It's the transfer point. It's when this version of the timeline deposits what it knows into the next version. The logbook is how I sent the information back. The wreckage at Harrow Canal was the mechanism. You had to find it. You had to live through the week. You had to understand what I understood before the transfer could complete, because a transfer of incomplete understanding produces incomplete continuity, and incomplete continuity is what destroyed the version before me. There was a version before him. I asked about it. He said there have been several iterations. He did not tell me how many. He said the logbook has been through multiple versions of this week, each time with slightly more information than the last, each time with the record of what went wrong in the previous iteration encoded in the pages, which is why some sections are illegible, why the damage is not uniform, why some entries are pristine while others are almost entirely destroyed. Each version of the logbook is a palimpsest of every previous attempt. The water damage is real, but the information loss is selective, and the selection is not random. What survives is what needed to survive. I asked him about the Veldmore connection. He was quiet for a moment, the specific kind of quiet that precedes something difficult, and then he said, Veldmore wasn't doing temporal inscription research. Temporal inscription is a description after the fact. What they were actually doing was attempting to identify naturally occurring transfer points, places and circumstances where the membrane between adjacent timeline iterations is thin enough to allow information to pass through. They found several. The Harrow Canal site is one of them. The project was shut down not because it failed, but because one of the researchers initiated a transfer without authorization, and the program became compromised. The researcher was me, an earlier me. That's the origin point. He stayed for 40 minutes in total. He answered what he could. There were questions he declined to answer, not evasively, but with a directness that made clear the refusal was itself protective, that knowing certain things before the transfer would interfere with the transfer, that the logbook had been calibrated carefully to give me exactly the amount of information required and no more. Before he left, he showed me his left arm clearly, in good light. The two marks were old scars, faded to silver white, perfectly defined. He said, "When yours look like this, you'll know it's close." I checked my arm after he was gone. The marks are further along than they were this morning. The clarification is accelerating. He told me two other things before he went. The first was about the archivist, the UK caller, the controlled voice, the question about whether I'd retrieve the whole logbook. He said the archivist is not an ally. He said the archivist represents what remains of the Veldmore program's institutional continuation, a private interest that has been monitoring transfer events since 1998 and that intervenes when it can to prevent transfers from completing. Not out of malice, he said, but out of a misalignment of interests so fundamental that malice and neutrality are, in practical effect, indistinguishable. Do not respond to the archivist. Do not tell the archivist what is in the final entry. The second thing he told me was about the final page. He said, "Read the final entry carefully. It tells you what to do and when to do it. Follow the instructions exactly. The margin for error on the last step is very small, and previous iterations have failed at the last step because they tried to understand it before executing it. You don't need to understand it. You need to trust it. Trust the handwriting. It's yours." He was gone before I could ask what happens if I fail, whether there would be another iteration, whether the destruction of the previous iteration, the one he'd mentioned, incomplete continuity, something destroyed, whether that was permanent destruction or simply the end of that particular instance. I have been sitting with that unanswered question all afternoon. Tomorrow is February 28th. I have one more entry to read, the final page, the one that has been waiting since I first lifted the logbook from the mud at Harrow Canal, the one I have been building toward through 7 days of correlation and static and encounter, and the slow revelation of a framework so large and so intricate that I am still only partially able to perceive its edges. Tonight I will read it, and tomorrow I will tell you everything. If there is a tomorrow. It is February 28th, 2026. I read the final entry last night. I read it 3 times. I'm going to tell you what it says, and then I'm going to tell you what I've done since reading it, and then I'm going to leave you with the coordinates and the instructions, because the final entry makes clear that the transmission of this information is not incidental to the transfer. It is the transfer. The audience is not a witness to this event. The audience is a component of it. I need you to understand that before I go further, because what I'm about to ask of you is specific, and the specificity matters. The logbook knew you were watching. The final page of the logbook, written in my handwriting, in ink that is cleaner and darker than the surrounding pages, as though it was written last but absorbed the damage least, as though it was protected somehow by the nature of its contents, reads as follows. I will read it completely and without interruption, because the previous version of me went to considerable trouble to write it in complete, uninterrupted sequence, and I think that was intentional. Tonight, the static will stop. This is how you know the window is open. The silence will be total, and it will begin at exactly 11:47 p.m. and last for 4 minutes and 38 seconds. During this silence, you will take the logbook to the location you identified in the satellite imagery, the structure near the Beldmore coordinates. You will not go inside the structure. You will stand at its northern exterior wall and you will wait. The transfer does not require your presence inside. It requires your presence at the boundary. You will bring the logbook and nothing else. Do not bring a phone. Do not bring recording equipment. The archivist monitors transfer frequencies, and recording devices create a signal that is identifiable within that monitoring framework. This is non-negotiable. If you are detected before the window closes, the transfer aborts and the iteration terminates. I know you want to document this. I know that instinct is almost overwhelming, but this is the step previous iterations failed at. They documented the final step, and the archivist found them. At the boundary of the structure, at the northern wall, you will find a section of wall that is already marked. The marks will match yours. When you see them, place your left forearm against the wall so that your marks align with the wall's marks. You will know when alignment is achieved because the static, which has stopped, will return for exactly 1 cycle of the sequence and then stop again permanently. When it stops the second time, open the logbook to the final page. You will see that this page is now blank. It won't be blank. It will have been written in ink that is only visible under the resonant frequency the wall emits at the moment of transfer. You don't need to read it. You need to press the page flat against the wall, over the marks, and hold it there. The transfer will take 43 seconds. You will feel it. I cannot describe what you will feel because every iteration describes it differently, and I think the experience is specific to the individual state of the iteration. What I can tell you is that it is not painful and it is not frightening. It feels, previous accounts agree on this much, like remembering something you didn't know you'd forgotten. When it is complete, leave the logbook against the wall. Do not take it with you. The book stays. The book is the door, and the door must remain at the threshold. Come home. Sleep. Wake up on March 1st. The marks will be gone. The static will be gone. The archivist will have no further reason to contact you because the frequency signature they monitor will have resolved and dispersed. You will remember everything that happened this week with perfect clarity, and you will also have access to memories you currently don't have, memories that were not accessible to you before the transfer completed, memories from iterations you don't yet know you lived. You will want to make another video. Let some time pass before you do. Let the memories settle into their correct places. What you tell people afterward will be important. Tell them the coordinates. Tell them to watch for others who find logbooks. The transfer points are not singular, and the Veldmore program, whatever it has become, did not catalog all of them. There are people finding books right now in places like Harrow Canal, in wreckage and in floodwater and in the walls of buildings that should be empty. And they are watching their handwriting on pages they didn't write, and they are counting down to dates that feel like endings. Tell them the dates are not endings. Tell them the dates are doors. I'm sorry for the fear. The fear was necessary. The fear is what makes the week real, and the week has to be real for the transfer to hold. If you had found the book and felt nothing, if you had picked it up with detachment, processed it as a curiosity, folded it into a content framework without allowing its reality to penetrate, the transfer would have had nothing to anchor to. The fear is the anchor. That's the part that took the longest to understand, and the part that I most wish I could have spared you. One more thing. The previous iteration, the one I mentioned, the one that ended in incomplete continuity, her name was Nora. She was the version before me. She failed at the last step, not because she brought recording equipment, and not because the archivist found her, but because she stopped at the boundary and turned back. She couldn't make herself stay at the wall in the silence. She came home, and she tried to find another way, a safer way, a way that didn't require standing alone at midnight against a structure in the marsh with her arm against a wall she didn't understand. She died on March 3rd, not on the date, 3 days after, in an ordinary way that had nothing to do with transfers or logbooks or static in the walls. She died because the incomplete transfer left a gap in the continuity, and the gap expanded until the iteration couldn't sustain itself. Don't turn back. The wall is not dangerous. The transfer is not dangerous. The turning back is dangerous. Trust the handwriting. It's yours. I love you. That is the complete text of the final entry. I've read it enough times that I no longer need to hold the page to recite it. The love you at the end is the thing that stays with me most, the way it shifted in those 2 words from instruction to something else entirely. Some version of me sat somewhere and wrote that with full knowledge that I would read it alone at a kitchen table in the early hours of February 28th, frightened and sleep-deprived, and carrying the weight of a week that has reshaped everything I thought I understood about time and continuity and what a self actually is. And that version chose to end with love. I think that was the most deliberate choice in the entire document, more deliberate than the coordinates, more deliberate than the specific timing of the silence, more deliberate than any of the technical precision that fills the preceding 40 pages. It is now 9:17 p.m. I've been recording this segment for several hours, stopping and starting, organizing what I know into the shape it needs to take for the transmission to be complete. The logbook is on the table next to me, sealed in the same Ziploc bag I put it in days ago. The static continues in the walls, its patient 437 cycling through the building with the indifferent regularity of a pulse. In 2 hours and 30 minutes, if the final entry is right, and the final entry has been right about everything, it will stop. Here is what I need from you. I'm not asking you to believe me. Belief is not the mechanism. The mechanism is attention and witnesses and the coordinates being held in enough minds that they persist regardless of what happens to me between now and morning. The coordinates are 4 degrees 37 minutes 22 seconds north, 18 degrees 44 minutes 09 seconds east. Write them down. Keep them. If you find in the days and weeks after tonight that someone else is describing a logbook, a handwriting match, a countdown, a rhythm in the walls, send them the coordinates. Tell them about Veldmore. Tell them about Nora. Tell them the dates are not endings. I want to say something about what this week has cost, because I think it matters to name it. I have been frightened in a way I have no prior reference point for. The kind of frightened that doesn't localize in the body as adrenaline or flee response, but spreads through everything, becomes the medium you move through rather than a state you're in. I have lost the capacity to experience my own apartment as a neutral space. The walls mean something different now. The handwriting on every surface I encounter produces a second of vertigo before I confirm it isn't a new entry. The face in every mirror requires a moment of identification before I'm certain it's mine, and not slightly older, slightly scarred, looking at me with the exhausted apology of a version that has already been through this. I don't know what I'll find on the other side of tonight. The final entry describes memories I don't currently have, earlier iterations, earlier versions, a continuity deeper and wider than the one I can currently perceive. That prospect is extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. I don't know if the Nora mentioned in the entry is her real name, or a name she gave herself in her logbook, or a name a previous version assigned her in the record. I don't know if there are others out there tonight, at other transfer points the Veldmore program never cataloged, standing at their own walls in their own silences, their own marks aligning with their own walls. I think there are. I think the project opened something that cannot be cleanly closed, and the archivist and whatever institutional architecture surrounds them is managing an event that is larger than management. I think the logbooks are still accumulating somewhere, in wreckage and in floodwater, and in the compressed, protected spaces inside collapsed structures, waiting for the correct hands to find them. If you find one, it is yours. It is from you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and don't let anyone convince you the date on the final page is an ending before you've read every word preceding it. It is now 11:39 p.m. I've been watching the clock for the last hour in the way you watch a clock, when the specific minute matters, and the minutes before it are just time to endure. The static is still running. 8 more minutes. I have the logbook. I have the address of the nearest route to the Veldmore coordinates, mapped on paper, old-fashioned paper, no phone. I have my gray jacket. The left cuff button is still broken, and I am for some reason glad of that. Glad to be going as exactly myself as I can manage, broken button and all, into whatever this is. If you don't hear from me after tonight, the coordinates stand on their own. They mean what they mean regardless of whether I'm here to contextualize them. The logbook stays at the wall, and the wall is at 4 degrees 37 minutes 22 seconds north, 18 degrees 44 minutes 09 seconds east, and the door opens from the inside. It is now 11:46 p.m. The static has stopped.